everyone. Welcome to FieldPartner, and thank you for joining us for another of these interviews. This is Christine Patterson, and I'm really happy to be able to welcome Andy McCullough as my guest today. Andy is someone I only met in person a few weeks ago, but I've been impacted by his book called Global Humility. And so I really wanted to share his story with you and have him speak a little bit about his book as well. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's really nice to connect. It's quite amazing to be in different continents, but be able to connect like this and chat together. So great.
Isn't it? Yeah. So, right, Andy, let's start at the beginning, which is what we always try to do. So tell us your roots, tell us where you were born and raised, and how you came to faith.
So I was born and I grew up in Cyprus, which is a small island in the Mediterranean. It's unusual because it's a divided island. One half is Greek and the other half is Turkish. I grew up in the Greek Cypriot side. So I was born there, lived there till I was 17, and then I moved to the UK. My parents are British, so they were living there as expatriates, and I grew up kind of cross-culturally. And because Cyprus is a really mixed place in the Middle East, lots of people from lots of different places, it was actually a really rich, multicultural upbringing.
I bet. So was it education that made you go back to the UK?
Yeah, I actually got kicked out of school when I was 16. And so and because it's a small island, all the schools talk to each other, so no one else would take me. So I went to the UK to continue education, to do some A-levels, so the final 2 years of high school. And it was actually when I moved to the UK that I encountered Jesus really meaningfully for myself. I think there was something about moving country at 17, feeling, that sort of dislocation and
right.
Not really having ever lived in England, not really understanding things, and feeling quite lonely. And it was in that context that a friend invited me to church that I put my faith in Jesus and was baptized when I was 17.
Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. I know that from the inside what that feels like too, as I was sent back from Africa to England at the age of 13 and had what we called and now I call anyway, the hidden immigrant experience, when you look like everyone else, but inside you feel very, very different. So I can certainly
totally.
relate.
So I'd grown up, Cyprus, on the beach every day, very multilingual environment, very, very slow, very relaxed. Very warm, hospitable culture, and then you come to England, which is I think it's a really difficult country to move to, England, partly because people are quite private, they keep themselves to themselves, and so it's quite difficult to make friends and to meet people and to find the warmth that you're used to from a warmer culture.
Right. And warm climate as well. I remember the bitter cold of the winter. And
yeah. I'm solar powered. I only get energy from the sun. So in the winter, I'm useless.
Right. Okay. So you did your A-levels. Did you then go on to university, or what did you do?
As soon as I came to faith, I had a sense that I wanted to be someone who carried the gospel across boundaries to people who'd never heard about Jesus. That was kind of in me straight from coming to faith. And so I actually wanted to go and do that. So I finished my A-levels and I went to India with OM on a team for 6 months, which I absolutely loved. And
whereabouts in India?
I was in Pune.
Oh, right.
And it was a team of 7 Indian guys and then me as the only foreigner. And we basically knocked doors 6 days a week, 9 to 5. So it's a wonderful, immersive experience into kind of evangelistic ministry, but also into a cross-cultural space where I was the only white guy. And so absolutely loved it, wanted to stay, got offered a job and just thought, this is my dream. Here we go, we're off. And I actually felt the Lord lead me really clearly to go to the UK and go to university.
Mm-hmm.
And I was bitterly disappointed to be led that way. But went to the UK to study and met my wife pretty much soon after.
Well, that might have been the reason.
Yeah, wisdom of God, eh? Met Jess, who was from South Africa. She'd only just moved to the UK as well. And so we met at church, but we bonded over the fact that we were both sort of new to London, didn't know anyone. Yeah, we both had the same first Sunday at church, and they did a lunch for visitors and new people. So that was nice. So we met at the lunch and we were chatting, found out we were both new. And these two old ladies took her to one side and warned her and said, "We don't know that man. Don't meet him on your own." But then 3 years later, when we announced our engagement to the church, the same two old ladies were like, "Oh, we knew it from the first time that we saw you." I'm like, "No, you liars. You warned her off me."
She had the grace to tell you, did she?
Absolutely, yeah.
So when 3 years later you were engaged, did you get married pretty soon after that, or?
Yeah. We didn't actually date. We were both, quite kind of kingdom focused, and we both kind of had said to the Lord, look, we only want to engage with someone if it's serious and we're going to get married. So we kind of went from being friends in a circle of friends to being married. So graduated university, got married, and were part of launching a church plant in a really multicultural bit of London, all in the same year. And then sort of from there, we were kind of up to our eyeballs in church planting. Great.
So, and this was already with Newfrontiers, was it?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So this was a Newfrontiers church plant in a place called Hillingdon, which is a really diverse bit of West London near Heathrow Airport.
We just lived in Hayes for 10 years, so we know Hillingdon.
Oh, there you go. Well, we were in Hayes for a while, and also Southall. And
wow.
So our street, we were the only white people on our street.
Right. That's a little bit of India, right there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, they call it Little India, don't they? So absolutely diverse. And so it's a wonderful place to live, to have our kids, to raise our kids. It's a great, it's such a rich, again, multicultural, diverse environment. The kind of space that we love being in. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, and then what? Then why did you move on? And how many kids had you got by then?
So again, we're a little bit sort of intentional. We wanted 4 kids. We knew that because neither of us had been born in the UK, if our kids could be born in the UK, then that's a good thing. And we also knew that we would move at some point to church plant again, probably into the Middle East. And in fact, I had this experience where when I was 19, I'd felt the Lord speak to me quite clearly about it being 11 years until we went. So in other words, we would go when we were 30, which actually really held us down, because it meant, okay, we're not going next week. We can be here, we can start our family, we can get some training, we can cut our teeth on ministry here in London. And so we did these things. So we had 4 kids. And when we moved in 2009 to Istanbul, our kids were 6, 4, 2, and a baby. So 4 young kids.
Okay. So that was 2009, you say?
Right.
Right. Okay. So Newfrontiers is a church planting movement, would you call it? What was their requirement for you to have done cross-cultural training, or did they feel you didn't actually need it because of your backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, I think Newfrontiers is a kind of a big international network of churches, family of churches around the world, and there isn't like a one formalized, centralized track for preparation for people. And so I think often it's about local church experience. So the fact that we'd been in leadership in a local church in London, in a really diverse environment. And during that time, I'd done some theological training. I think some of those things are, they're about character and about grit. And so they're less about specifically cross-cultural skill set, but they are about, do you know what you're doing around people and church and the Bible? And so I would say that's been a part of the Newfrontiers thing. And then they're really strong on coaching when you're in country.
Okay.
So we were, I would say, very well coached whilst in place in Turkey.
Right. So how much do you feel that your background really equipped you then for doing that in yet another new culture?
I think there are cross-cultural kind of skills that you intuit if you've grown up in cross-cultural spaces, which both my wife and I had done. And so I think that some of those things can be taught, but I certainly feel very privileged to have kind of grown up in the spaces that we've just talked about, in terms of a sort of an ability to connect with people from different backgrounds, and particularly sort of Middle East, which is our world, so Eastern Mediterranean, Middle Eastern people. So I think there are things that can be taught, but sometimes it's more about, and this is really what I was trying to do with the book Global Humility, sometimes it's less about skills and it's more about attitudes and heart things and perspectives.
Exactly.
I think those are the key things, and they're quite intangible.
Okay, so I'll come back to that because that's really key. But why did you eventually leave living in Turkey and you returned to the UK? Is that right? At that point?
That was mostly kind of family health reasons. Jess was unwell, and one of our boys has quite severe special needs, and as he got older, they got more complex and harder to manage. So it's a combination of kind of family factors. While I think that's always hard, it's also what we do, isn't it? Like, church is family. You're called together as a family, and in the wisdom of God, again, another reluctant move to the UK, and another kind of grace from God in terms of opening doors for the next season of life in ministry. So that is
right.
That's the wisdom of God. He can see things in the future that we can't.
For sure. And so at that point you moved to Reading, is that right?
Yeah, correct. So we, the church here in Reading, the Newfrontiers Church, Reading Family Church, was one of our supporting churches. So we knew them a little bit. We didn't know them really well, but we reached out and we were like, if we came and landed in Reading, would you help us? And they were like, yeah. And they've been incredible in terms of helping us land, get established. And I think even that is quite a unique grace that some churches seem to be good at, helping people enter and settle and get orientated.
Right. So now that you're based back in the UK, how do you continue to engage, and what is your role now towards the work that you were involved with in Turkey?
Yeah, so I've kind of got two jobs, or two halves of a job. Half of my job is on the staff at Reading Family Church as one of the pastors there. And the other half of my job is on behalf of Newfrontiers, working kind of in two ways. One is across our network, helping facilitate, if you like, best practice conversation around cross-cultural training and sending. I sometimes see it like this. There's a Newfrontiers narrative or story or journey, which is like a river with a lot of momentum. But there's also the wider mission conversation and best practice and things that are being talked about, which is like another big river. And I feel like I'm standing at the place where those two meet and trying to facilitate the meeting so that we get the best out of both bits of momentum. And so we do that through what we call the Unreached Network, which is basically an informal network of people from across our family of churches and more widely. So there's training, and there's conferencing, and there's content creation, and so it's, in a way, it's quite similar to what you do, Christine. But we're in a sense translating the wider mission conversation into language that's really pertinent for our movement, and trying to get our people better at thinking cross-culturally and building diverse churches and reaching the unreached and keeping mission as a priority for pastors. So that's one piece of what I do. The other bit of what I do is actually hands-on, involved in helping to plant new churches, mostly in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East area, and kind of coaching and supporting some church planters and also some indigenous leaders in that space. So facilitating spaces where churches get planted and thrive in that world too.
Right. There was one story in your book that kind of intrigued me. You were talking about how you needed to change your style of worship, having been very informal in London. But when you moved to Turkey, you needed to have much more kind of formality in dress and, showing respect to the people. And can you just go into that? Because I think that's a lovely cameo of what, high context, low context, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, to use your phrase, English culture, or particularly London culture, would be quite low context. So in other words, the words that you say, the content in church is really important, but the environment hasn't been so important. So we met in a dirty school hall. People could, jeans with rips in them, or shorts and flip-flops or whatever. And for the most part, people didn't mind about the environment. They just were focused on the content. Certainly Turkey is quite a high context culture. Whereas if you put a Turk in a space like that, they would be so distracted or impacted by the environment. The room's dirty. Why can't I see your toes? Why is your shirt untucked? So that would create so much static that they wouldn't actually be able to hear the important message about Jesus that you are offering. And so what we learned was that for Turks, the medium is the message, and you can't separate the kind of the context that you're creating from the important. So if you're saying something important, you have to dress importantly, and you have to have a
little bit of distance, presumably, with the, if you're going to be preaching from God's word, you need to, not be too casual about it.
Absolutely. And so, for example, the venue that we were meeting in as a church when we first started probably reflected more our London way of thinking. And as people came to faith with us, and we were always saying, look, this is your church, we're church together. Some of the Turkish guys started going, well, if can we do something about this venue, please? So we were like, well, sort it out. It's your church. So Turkish guys took a bit of budget and did some work on the venue. We came back and looked at it, and it was completely, we had dim lighting, a thick carpet, a big cross on the wall, silver trays for the Lord's Supper, a picture of Jesus on the wall, so just completely different. And the Turkish guys were like, now this feels like a church. Now I feel spiritual. Now I can invite my friends here. And just found that it really, really mattered. So I started polishing my shoes and wearing a tie, and, just completely different world for me. But that is, I think, like you say, Christine, it's a great illustration of the difference between a low context culture and a high context culture. And it isn't that one's right and one's wrong. It's that different cultures respond to context differently.
Exactly. So let's go on to talking about your book then. Global Humility, Attitudes for Mission. I'd say that's a very arresting title. What lies behind you choosing that title or wanting to write on that theme? And what have you observed in yourself and others that speaks to that need?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've observed, as I'm sure you have, and some of the listeners have would be the people that do really well cross-culturally in terms of connecting with people and making friends and engaging, and the people that don't seem to do so well cross-culturally. I think it's less about skill and qualifications, how many degrees someone's got, or and it seems to be more about attitude. So attitude to difference, attitude to the other. And if I was going to drill into that, I would say that the requisite attitude seems to be this humility towards people from different backgrounds, and the fact that you're not just coming to teach, you're coming to learn. You're not just coming to talk, you're coming to listen. I think that Jesus models this for us. We see in Jesus a great model of humility. You know, his condescension to take flesh, to live among people. The fact that he spent 30 years listening and 3 years talking, which I think is a great ratio. And if we could get our people to do that, people would think it was very inefficient. But I think Jesus' 30 years living among people, feeling their pain, sharing life, sharing food, rendered his 3 years of talking incredibly fruitful, because he was able to address people's needs, scratch where they were itching. I think often cross-cultural missionaries turn up and go, hello, we've got all the answers. And people are like, we didn't even ask you a question. And I think sometimes we see mission as monologue and like preaching, teaching, explaining, informing. Whereas with Jesus, so often, you know, you look at John's gospel, it was dialogue, and like he's talking to the Samaritan woman, he's talking to Nicodemus, he's talking to Lazarus. And so I just think in all of that, I felt really quite compelled to write about the fact that I think this humility, this openness to difference, openness to the other, willingness to learn, to be changed, to be transformed by the mission experience, the privilege of living cross-culturally. I just wanted to write about that from some of my own experience, but also from some, you know, kind of quoting from a wide range of mission authors and try and just funnel that into this one idea.
Right. And so you're quite provocative. I quote, "I'm persuaded that the aspects that needs training more than any other in cross-cultural work is this humility, as you've just been saying. And how dare you turn up with all the answers when you don't even know what questions people are asking. Pride and mission are polar opposites. Pride pollutes mission. The mission of Christ is humble mission." So, I mean, you've already started to unpack that, but what manifestations of pride do you see in cross-cultural workers coming in, and what is the best way to deal with it?
Yeah, so I think ethnocentrism is a form of pride that is in everybody.
Right.
So, you know, English people would go, for example, Germans are too serious, Italians are too fun, but we're just right. Yeah, so I think everyone always puts themselves in the middle of a spectrum.
Absolutely.
And I think the only answer to ethnocentrism, to thinking that your way of doing things is normal or is the best way or is the only way, the only answer to that is to be exposed to other cultures. There's no other way. You can't fix ethnocentrism in a vacuum or in a classroom. And so I think that Jesus takes his disciples on mission very early in their discipleship journey. You know, the sending out of the 12, it's right at the beginning of the Gospels, right? And because I think mission is part of the discipleship. If you're going to get some of this stuff out of people, you can only do it by exposing them to difference, to putting them into cross-cultural spaces. And so I think it's an important part of discipleship. And I think a lot of discipleship is about being conformed to Christ. And that is about melting some of the pride that is inherent. And I think particularly if you're from a Western culture, so North Atlantic culture, even if you think you are individually humble, the reality is that people from many other parts of the world, in a post-colonial world, will see you as culturally arrogant. So you might be a humble American, but because you're American, people will automatically perceive an arrogance in you, even if it's not there, and ascribe it to you because of the big, proud nation that you come from. And so I think we've got to work extra hard to make sure that the gospel never has the packagings of individual or cultural pride. I think the gospel is only ever, you got a naked baby in a manger offered to the world, vulnerable. And I think that is the packaging of the gospel that we're shown in scripture, and anything else is inappropriate. Right.
But the trouble with how we acquire our culture is that we actually acquire it before we even have language. So we're mostly unaware. I mean, in the first module of my course, I actually try and say, look, you don't know what you don't know about your own culture. And as you say, until we're exposed to another culture, that doesn't show up. So, I mean, I think that you're giving a very good answer. You can't do it in a vacuum. You have to be in that place of exposure before it really comes to light. And then you have to say, oh, yes, this is what I need to come to terms with, and be willing for it.
Yeah. And I think, for example, it's not for nothing that there's a connection between, certainly with the UK scene, between churches that build quite a diverse, multicultural local church and are effective at sending people, because that is already a training space for people. If it's a genuinely multicultural church in the UK, for example, and you've got friends from lots of different nations, and you're exposed to other ways of doing family, or other ways of reading the Bible, or other ways of looking after your money, or other ways of navigating education. So you're already exposed to difference. That's already a strength for you. When you go, homogeneity so often creates weakness. That's why we need to mix the gene pool, right? And so there is a strength that comes from diversity that helps people, I think, even in that connection between what their local church is like and where they end up going. Now, it's not possible for everyone in every space, but that is certainly a notable connection.
And so really, before people even go, they need to have reached out to other, just crossing the road nowadays with globalization, you're likely to bump into someone from another culture. To feel as though you're going to change and be able to mix and adapt when you get to the other country is nonsense if you actually can't start to do it at home. I agree.
Absolutely. And the skills that you need in terms of listening, saying, listening without judging, saying, tell me your story. Those are the skills you're going to need anywhere, and they're incredibly rich skills. The skills of showing honor to people, things like hospitality, things like taking time with people, being available. Those are all, again, they're all quite inefficient things, aren't they? They're all things that ask a lot of us. But I agree that those, even if the people across your road are African and you're going to end up going to Nepal, I think the ability just to slow down the intuitive response, which is, wow, that's really wrong, and to go, oh, that's really different. We're always going to get our people just to slow down a little bit before they leap to conclusions or evaluations or judgments about cultural things.
Right. Okay, so you talk about one requisite capacity for anyone who is going to be effective in another culture, and that is the ability to handle grey rather than seeing everything as black and white. I think that's probably another side of what you're already saying, but can you explain that a bit more for us?
Again, I think people from the West are used to quite a defined black and white world, particularly in the world of religion, particularly in the world of Christianity. So it's right or it's wrong, it's true or it's false. I'm right and you're wrong, which is very different to certainly the Middle Eastern world. And the Bible was written remember, in a Middle Eastern world. So it was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. And even in the Bible, there's a lot of grey where you look at things and you go, is he right or is he right? And it might be both. And so actually those kind of skill and even just being convinced, evangelical Christianity is very sort of mono. It's convinced that there's only one way of doing things or one way of seeing things. But the majority of evangelicals are not in the global north, they're in the global south, and might have a broader spectrum of views or perspectives on things. And so I do think a lot of this starts with the Bible and faith, because if we're persuaded that the Bible has more grey in it than we were taught, or again, that softens our certainty. It opens us up to seeing things slightly differently, because when if we think it's our religion or our faith in God that has driven us into such narrow perspectives on things, then it's very hard to compete with that, which is why so often I want to start with the Bible and show people in Scripture.
You give an example about taking a bribe, or giving a bribe rather. So would you like to unpack that one?
Yeah, I think bribery is quite contentious. In many parts of the world, it's part of life, but it wouldn't be called bribery. It would just be called giving gifts or influence or relationship or, hospitality. So there are lots of different nuances around it. And I think the Bible recognizes that. So the book of Proverbs mentions bribery 6 times. And 3 of them are positive and 3 of them are negative. And right. The ones are like, the powerful should not extort a bribe out of the powerless. Absolutely. It's a justice issue. But the positive ones, for example, the famous verse, the gift opens the way for the giver and ushers him into the presence of the great. It's an observational wisdom that does work, that, gift giving wins friends and that influence, and that's part of the way that the world works. So for example, when we were in Turkey, getting into school involved making donations, and that's because the schools weren't well equipped. The government schools weren't well equipped with stuff. So actually the donation you make ends up being what they use to buy pencils and exercise books. And if you just came in and went, oh, this is a bribe and it's trying to get me a place at school, then you might feel very differently about it. But if you understand that this is how the system works, this is how things get done, then you can do that with a clear conscience. Right. And so, and different cultures are different, and the church in different nations responds differently to bribery. But what I'm asking for, like always, is can we just slow down and ask the questions and try and understand the context, rather than just, we have one word in English and it's bribe, and it's quite a strong negative word, whereas some cultures are very nuanced and rich in their understanding of how these processes work within society. Does that make sense? Would you agree with that?
I would agree. And I think, the fact that you can refer to Scripture on both sides of that equation, I think is actually very helpful. And also the whole thing of who is powerful and who's not, as to how that plays out. Because the abuse of power and demanding of bribes, obviously, as you say, is totally wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Scriptures on that too.
I mean, another thing that actually has just occurred to me as we've been talking is, why is Christianity deemed to be a Western religion? I mean, when you think that the missionaries went out, and I think there was a sense of we need to civilize the nations, we need to export Western culture, without realizing that the gospel had to be enculturated in our context first. And, but then it needs to happen in the new culture as well. But that's another theme that you speak to. So can you just share a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's always happened, because the gospel doesn't exist just theoretically in the realm of ideas. The gospel is always incarnated in a life, in a message. It's always word made flesh. And so I think even in Galatians, this was the problem that they were hitting, was like, you've got the Judaizers who are going, oh, we need the gospel plus, you know, certain ways of eating or certain diary dates or whatever, because they're used to the gospel incarnated. And Paul's fighting in Galatians quite angrily for like, no, it needs to have a Greek packaging, a Gentile packaging, not a Jewish packaging. And so I think there's always two things involved, isn't there? And that's why it's so complicated. If we're going to translate the gospel into another culture, we have to de-Westernize it or unpackage the gospel from our own received Western influences. And that happens through the Bible and our understanding of scripture. But then we also have to find ways of repackaging or recontextualizing to the, you know, even if we're just translating language to the people that we're reaching. And so I think the difficulty with it has always been that the gospel isn't just abstract ideas. It is in lifestyle. It's in a community, the church. It's in language. So it's always embedded in crunchy things. And that's why so often people have offered the gospel about Jesus Christ plus some packaging, which now we look back and we go, oh, the colonial missionaries got it so wrong because they introduced, like you say, the gospel plus European cultural righteousness. Now you're a Christian, this is how you should dress, and you need archdeacons and organs. And, you know, I've got African friends who I'll like banter with them. You wear a suit to church, ha ha ha. And they're like, yeah, but it was you guys that taught us to wear a suit to church, you know? And you're like, yeah, it's a good point. And so I think, but we can look at how wrong the colonial missionaries got it 200 years ago. But the danger is we probably have our own blind spots.
Right.
So I would say at the moment, the idea of sort of leadership teaching, like this is what a leader looks like, that's so widespread. And, you know, books on leadership from American authors that have been translated into lots of languages is probably our modern equivalent. You know, you're trying to say, you know, here's the gospel plus some management techniques that you really need if you're going to be an effective Christian.
I'm also thinking of the opening story you tell about the Lebanese guy. You said, well, you know, how would you like people to come to your culture? Which I think really sums up how we need to be aware of how we're perceived. And, you know, the idea of, well, remind me what he actually said. I mean, he was quite outspoken in a very gentle way.
Yeah, I think so. I was sitting in Beirut with some family friends who are Christians, and they are very familiar with the missionary scene. They've seen people come and go over the years. We were talking and drinking, you know, Lebanese coffee. And as part of the conversation, I said, you know, what kind of people should come here? I was actually with a guy who was feeling called to Beirut. And so partly it was for him to, you know, hear from some Lebanese people, this is the kind of people, right? And they said, look, if you come here, you've got to learn Arabic. You've got to live among us. Don't live up on the hill in a big fancy house. Live where we live. You've got to be here for a long period of time because it's a complicated country and you can't just come and go and think that you've done something. Don't come and impose your story, your narrative, but come contribute to ours. You know, and they use the analogy of, you know, it's like there's a room, which is Lebanon, for example, where a conversation has been going on for generations, and a foreigner sometimes turns up, walks into the room, shouts a few things, and then leaves again, but the conversation in the room carries on. You know, so they were just going, if you want to be a meaningful part of the conversation and the narrative of what God is doing in our nation, then it needs to be on our terms, within our narrative, within our story. So that was the thing, you know, don't come and impose your story, but come and be part of ours. And I just think it's obvious, but for some reason, so many people are so tuned into their own story. This is me, and this is what God's called me to do, and this is where we're going, that they miss the fact that God's got a big story that's already going, and that you get to be a part of that, which is so much more exciting.
Absolutely. So I've got one more quote I'd like to bring in, which is, you say, when you enter a new culture, it can feel like death, brackets, if you do it well. So can you unpack that one?
Yeah, I think particularly that first period, the first few years, certainly when we send teams, we define that first few years for language learning and cultural learning and adaptation before they can switch on into any ministry. And that is a critical time, because you only get it once, you never get it back. It's a time when you're full of faith and energy and momentum because you've newly landed. So it's a great time for entering well. And I think that you can see how it's going to go for people in the long term, really, on how intentionally they use that first 2 years or 3 years to learn language, to acquire culture. And I think, again, there are two things that are happening. And one is you're letting go of some of your Western or home nation experiences and preferences. You're taking them off, you're letting them go, you're undressing from them. And then secondly, you're putting on some new things. And that's right across life. That's not just ministry stuff. That's, how you're doing with your family, and how you do food, and your health, and your rhythms of life, and how you do holidays. And so I think it's all of life. And I think that it can be really painful if you're saying to people, look, in that couple of years, like, don't take a trip home, give yourself here, give yourself to learning language, make local friends, don't just hang out in the expat community, don't just make friends with missionaries, don't just live in a pub, give yourself to local people. All of that can be really painful and really difficult.
Lots of stumbling nature of learning a language anyway, where you go back to baby status.
Oh yeah, you go from being super competent in your own country to suddenly being absolutely useless, and it's exhausting, and you're tired every night, your brain is tired, but it's so easy at those points to reach out to old habits, to just go and sit here and watch English TV and Netflix and just sort of and again, or just, I'm going to hang out with people like me, and we're going to do what we would normally do back home or whatever. And none of those things are wrong, but it's to do with intentionality, and it's to do with trusting the journey, trusting the process. And Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground, it remains one seed. But if it falls into the ground, then it produces many seeds. And by this, he was speaking of his death. And so Jesus was speaking of being buried into the earth in order to produce lots of fruit, being planted. And I think there is a similar thing that needs to happen with us, where we're planted into a place, where we die into a place. There was a great missionary to East Africa called Johann Krapf, and he said, we must build a cemetery before we build a church. And he was talking about the institutional structure, but he was also talking about personal journey, and the most beautiful flowers grow on graves, don't they? So I think there's something about planting ourselves into a place, dying into a place that will only produce good fruit in the long term, but that has to happen as part of the journey.
So do you think saying things like that would scare people off? Or maybe if they are scared off, it's a good idea that they should be. Because I think sometimes Jesus said to count the cost. So we need to know what the cost is.
100%. Yeah. I think it calls people out. So in the famous kind of missionary appeal thing is Isaiah 6, right? Where, God goes, who will go for us? And Isaiah goes, "Here I am, send me." And it's like the altar call, but no one ever reads the rest of the chapter, which is then God says to Isaiah, "Great, well, you're going to talk to people who won't listen to you. You're going to have a really hard, frustrating ministry." And Isaiah has a 7-decade ministry under difficult kings who don't really listen to him, and he ends up being sawn in half under the reign of King Manasseh. And no one ever tells that bit of the story. They're just like, "Here I am, send me." And so I think the Bible is honest about these things. I think we've got to be honest about these things. I think it calls out courage in people, as well as sifting out calling in people. And I think it's incredibly important, Christine, to help people count the cost.
Indeed. And also the other part of the counting the cost is when you go back to your own culture, you'll never fully belong there, having really enculturated in another culture. So there's that I think people need to face up to ahead of time as well, that this thing is going to change you to the point where, back home will not feel like home anymore. Anyway, so, well, I would say this has been the merest taster of your amazing book. And for those who want a deeper introduction, we're going to put a link to a course that Andy has done, which you will find on the Broadcast Network, and of course, a link to the book itself. And so it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Andy, for sharing a bit of your story and some of your insights from the book. And I hope that people will go and buy it, and they will expose themselves to a lot of the wisdom that you share. Lots of food for thought. And we're very grateful for your time. Thank you. Okay, so that's it for today. That's it for today. Thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed this interview, then please go spread the word. Tell people where to find other interviews and this particular one. And you can find the whole library if you go to our website, www.fieldpartner.org. Okay, so thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye, and thanks, Andy. God bless.